When I first moved to Chicago a few years ago, I was excited to start my new job and explore the city. I found a small but cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Lincoln Park. It was a bit pricey, but the location was perfect, and I figured I could make it work with my new salary. The building was older, with that classic Chicago brownstone charm, and I fell in love with it immediately. My next-door neighbor, Jake, seemed like a nice enough guy when I first met him. He was tall, with dark hair and glasses, and always wore a friendly smile. We bumped into each other in the hallway a few times during my first week, and he mentioned he worked nights at a local hospital. I thought it was great to have a neighbor with a different schedule since it meant we wouldn't disturb each other with noise. The first month went by smoothly. I was settling into my new job at a marketing firm downtown, making friends with my co-workers, and starting to feel like a real Chicagoan. I even learned to navigate the L without getting lost, which felt like a major accomplishment. But then, things started to get a bit odd. It began with small noises coming from Jake's apartment during the day. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had a day off or was just up early. I heard footsteps, the occasional cough, sometimes even what sounded like whispering. I assumed he might have a girlfriend or friends over. As the days went by, the noises became more frequent. I'd hear them almost every afternoon when I came home from work. Footsteps pacing back and forth, muffled conversations, and sometimes even crying. It was unsettling, but I tried to mind my own business. After all, everyone has their own life and problems, right? One Saturday morning, I ran into Jake in the hallway as I was heading out for a jog along Lake Michigan. We chatted for a bit, and I casually mentioned the noises, thinking maybe he had a roommate I hadn't met yet. That's when things got really weird. Jake looked at me with a confused expression and said he lived alone. He'd always lived alone, he insisted. I laughed it off, feeling a bit embarrassed. Maybe I was just hearing things from another apartment, or maybe the old building had quirky acoustics. I apologized for the misunderstanding and went on my run, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. But after that conversation, the noises seemed to increase. It wasn't just during the day anymore. I started hearing them at night too, even though I knew Jake was at work. The footsteps became more pronounced, and the whispering turned into what sounded like hushed arguments. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of crying coming through the wall. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Jake had lied about living alone. Maybe he had a secret roommate or a girlfriend he didn't want anyone to know about. But why would he lie about that? And why would they be in his apartment when he wasn't there? I started paying more attention to Jake's comings and goings. I noticed that he always left for work around 10 p.m. and returned around 7 a.m. The noises I heard never coincided with his presence in the apartment. It was always when he was gone. As the weeks went by, I found myself becoming more and more anxious. I'd dread coming home from work, knowing I'd have to listen to those mysterious sounds. I started staying late at the office or hanging out at cafes just to avoid being in my apartment during the day. My coworkers noticed the change in my behavior and asked if everything was okay. I brushed off their concerns, not wanting to sound crazy by telling them about my noisy, non-existent neighbor. One particularly bad night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching on the shared wall between Jake's apartment and mine. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It sounded deliberate, almost like someone was trying to claw their way through the wall. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened intently. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning I examined the wall carefully but couldn't see any marks or damage. I was starting to question my own sanity. Was I imagining all of this? Was the stress of my new job and life in a new city getting to me? I decided to talk to Jake again. I waited until I saw him in the hallway one evening as he was leaving for work. I tried to keep my tone casual as I brought up the noises again. I mentioned the scratching from the night before, hoping he might have an explanation. But Jake just looked at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. He said he hadn't heard anything, and reminded me that he worked nights. He suggested that maybe the building was just old and making strange noises. His response didn't sit well with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. But what could I do? I had no proof, and I didn't want to come across as the crazy new neighbor who complained about imaginary noises. As the days went on, the situation escalated. The noises became more frequent and more disturbing. I started hearing what sounded like furniture being moved around, loud thuds, and once, a blood-curdling scream that had me on the verge of calling the police. But every time I considered it, I hesitated. What would I tell them? That I heard noises from an apartment where no one was supposed to be? My work started to suffer. I was constantly tired from lack of sleep, jumpy and distracted. My boss pulled me aside one day to ask if everything was all right. I mumbled some excuse about having trouble adjusting to city life, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. I tried to do some investigating on my own. I asked other neighbors if they had heard anything strange, but most of them just shrugged it off. One elderly lady who lived below Jake mentioned that she sometimes heard noises too, but she attributed it to the building settling. I even went as far as to try and peek into Jake's apartment when he wasn't home. I know it wasn't the most ethical thing to do, but I was desperate for answers. I never saw anything out of the ordinary through the windows, just a normal, somewhat messy apartment. The situation came to a head one weekend when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, and the constant stress was taking a toll on my mental and physical health. I gathered up my courage and knocked on Jake's door, determined to confront him directly. To my surprise, Jake answered the door looking disheveled and tired. I hadn't seen him in a few days and was taken aback by his appearance. His usually neat hair was a mess, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Before I could say anything, he invited me in. As I stepped into his apartment for the first time, I was struck by how normal it looked. It was a mirror image of my own place with similar furniture and layout. But there was something off about it. The air felt heavy and stale, and there was a faint smell I couldn't quite place. I took a deep breath and explained everything to Jake. The noises, the scratching, the screams. I told him how it was affecting my life and that I needed to know what was going on. To my surprise, Jake didn't dismiss me or get defensive. Instead, he sank down onto his couch and put his head in his hands. After a long moment of silence, Jake started to talk. He explained that he had been going through a tough time lately. His night shift at the hospital was more stressful than he had let on, and he had been struggling with severe anxiety and depression. The noises I had been hearing were him, on his days off or when he came home early from work. The footsteps were from him pacing around his apartment, trying to calm his anxiety. The whispers were him talking to himself, trying to psych himself up to face another day. The crying, well, that was self-explanatory. He admitted that sometimes when things got really bad, he would have panic attacks that could explain the more violent noises I had heard. As for the scratching, Jake looked embarrassed as he explained that he had developed a nervous habit of scratching at the walls when he felt particularly anxious. He showed me the marks on the wall behind his couch, hidden from view. I sat there stunned. All this time, I had been imagining all sorts of scenarios, but the truth was both simpler and more heartbreaking than I could have guessed. Jake apologized profusely for causing me so much distress and explained that he had been too ashamed to admit his struggles to anyone. We talked for hours that day. Jake opened up about his mental health issues, the pressure of his job, and his feelings of isolation in the big city. I shared my own experiences of adjusting to life in Chicago and the toll the past few weeks had taken on me. By the end of our conversation, I felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that there wasn't some sinister explanation for the noises, and guilt for not reaching out to Jake sooner. We agreed to look out for each other moving forward. I promised to be more understanding of the noises, and Jake promised to seek professional help for his anxiety and depression. Over the next few months, things gradually improved. Jake started seeing a therapist and joined a support group for healthcare workers. The noises from his apartment became less frequent and less intense. We started having regular dinners together, checking in on each other and offering support when needed. A few years ago, I made the big move to Los Angeles, chasing dreams of making it in the entertainment industry like so many others before me. I'd saved up enough money from my waitressing job back in my small Midwest town to rent a tiny studio apartment in a slightly run-down building in Koreatown. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford, and I was just excited to finally be in LA. The apartment building was an old, 3-story structure with faded yellow paint and a creaky elevator that I quickly learned to avoid. My studio was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway with dingy carpet that had seen better days. But despite its flaws, I was determined to make it my home. On my first day, as I was lugging boxes up the stairs, the elevator was out of order naturally, I noticed an elderly man watching me from the doorway of the apartment next to mine. He was tall and thin, with wispy white hair and pale, almost translucent skin. When I smiled and waved, he merely nodded slightly and retreated into his apartment. Over the next few days, as I settled into my new place and started my job search, I kept running into this neighbor in the hallway. I learned that his name was Meister Thompson and that he'd lived in the building for over 30 years. He never said much, just nodded politely whenever we crossed paths. At first, I didn't think much of Mr. Thompson's quiet demeanor. I was too busy trying to navigate my new life in LA. I spent my days dropping off resumes at various talent agencies and production companies, and my nights working as a bartender at a small dive bar in Echo Park. It was exhausting, but I was determined to make it work. About a month into my LA adventure, I started noticing something odd. Every night when I came home from my bartending shift, usually around 2 or 3 a.m., I'd see a faint light coming from Mr. Thompson's apartment. At first, I thought maybe he was just a night owl or had trouble sleeping. But then I realized that the light was always coming from the same spot, right by his front window. One night, as I was fumbling with my keys, I glanced over and saw Mr. Thompson standing by his window, partially hidden by the curtain. He was just staring at me. I quickly looked away and hurried into my apartment, telling myself I was imagining things. But it kept happening. Night after night, I'd come home to find Mr. Thompson at his window, watching me. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see that faint light still on, knowing he was there, just on the other side of the wall. I started to feel uneasy in my own home. I found myself rushing down the hallway to my apartment, keeping my head down to avoid making eye contact with Mr. Thompson's window. I even started taking longer routes home, walking around the block a few times before entering the building, hoping that maybe he'd be asleep by the time I got there. But no matter what time I came home, he was always there, watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he had insomnia and just happened to look out the window when I came home. Maybe I was overreacting, still jumpy from the late-night shifts at the bar and the stress of trying to make it in a new city. Weeks went by, and the situation didn't improve. In fact, it seemed to be escalating. I started noticing Mr. Thompson more during the day. When I'd leave for auditions or my bartending job, I'd often see him in the hallway, seemingly waiting for me. He never said anything, just watched as I walked past. I considered talking to him about it, but something always held me back. Maybe it was the way his pale blue eyes seemed to look right through me, or the eerie silence that surrounded him. Whatever it was, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Instead, I tried to adjust my schedule. I started leaving for auditions earlier and coming home from the bar later, hoping to avoid running into him. But it didn't matter. No matter what time I came and went, he always seemed to be there, watching. One morning, about 3 months after I moved in, I woke up to find a small piece of paper that had been slipped under my door. My heart raced as I picked it up and read the 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. It said, "I see you." I stood there, frozen, staring at the note. There was no signature, but I knew it had to be from Mr. Thompson. Who else could it be? I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized just how much this man had been watching me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of my audition and work shift. But my mind was back in that hallway, on that small piece of paper. When I got home that night, I hesitated outside the building, looking up at the windows. Sure enough, there was Mr. Thompson, his silhouette visible behind the thin curtain. I gathered my courage and decided it was time to confront him. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly on edge in my own home. I took a deep breath and walked up to his door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked, waited, and knocked again. No answer. I could hear movement inside, but Mr. Thompson wasn't coming to the door. After a few minutes, I gave up and went back to my apartment, feeling defeated and more scared than ever. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to catch Mr. Thompson and have a conversation. But when I opened my door, I froze. There, right outside my apartment, were a series of footprints in the hallway carpet. They led from Mr. Thompson's door to mine, stopping right outside my bedroom window. I felt sick to my stomach. Had he been standing outside my window while I slept? How long had this been going on? I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed back into my apartment, locked the door, and called the building manager. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Maria, listened to my story with a concerned expression. She promised to talk to Mr. Thompson and check on the situation. I spent the rest of the day in my apartment, jumping at every little noise, constantly checking the window to see if Mr. Thompson was watching. That evening, Maria came back with some surprising news. She had knocked on Mr. Thompson's door multiple times throughout the day, but there was no answer. Finally, concerned, she had used her master key to enter the apartment. What she found shocked us both. The apartment was completely empty. Not just vacant, but devoid of any furniture, personal items, or signs that anyone had lived there recently. The only things in the entire apartment were a chair by the window and a small table with a lamp, the source of the light I'd been seeing every night. Maria was baffled. She told me that as far as she knew, Mr. Thompson had been living there for decades. She had never received any notice that he was moving out. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only that chair and lamp. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was relieved that Mr. Thompson was gone, but another part was even more freaked out. Where had he gone? How had he moved out without anyone noticing? And most importantly, had he really been there all this time? Or had my mind been playing tricks on me? Over the next few days, I tried to piece together what had happened. I talked to other neighbors, but most of them knew even less about Mr. Thompson than I did. A few mentioned that they'd seen him around but had never spoken to him. No one seemed to know anything about his personal life or family. I even went as far as to check with the local hospitals and police station, worried that something might have happened to him. But there was no record of any Mr. Thompson matching his description. As the days turned into weeks, life in the apartment building slowly returned to normal. Maria cleaned out Mr. Thompson's apartment and started showing it to potential new tenants. I tried to put the whole bizarre experience behind me and focus on my acting career and my job at the bar. But I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Every time I came home late at night, I found myself glancing at the window of Mr. Thompson's old apartment, half expecting to see that faint light and his silhouette. Sometimes I could swear I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. But when I looked, there was never anyone there. I started to question everything about my experience with Mr. Thompson. Had he really been watching me all those nights? Or had it been my imagination, fueled by the stress of moving to a new city and trying to make it in a tough industry? Was the note real? Or had I somehow convinced myself it existed? And those footprints outside my door, had they really been there? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear I'd felt when I thought Mr. Thompson was watching me. At least then I had something concrete to be afraid of. Now, I was left with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe Mr. Thompson had been planning to move out all along, and his strange behavior was just his way of dealing with the change. Maybe he had dementia or some other condition that made him act oddly. Or maybe I had blown the whole thing out of proportion, seeing threats where there were none. As the months went by, I slowly started to feel more comfortable in my apartment. I made friends with some of the other tenants, young aspiring actors and musicians like myself. We'd often gather in the courtyard of the building, sharing stories about auditions and gigs and dreams of making it big. I never told any of them about my experience with Mr. Thompson, partly because I was embarrassed, feeling like I had overreacted to an eccentric old man, but partly because a small part of me still wasn't sure what had really happened, and talking about it made it feel too real. Eventually, a new tenant moved into Mr. Thompson's old apartment. She was a friendly grad student named Alexis, always ready with a smile and a wave when we passed in the hallway. Seeing her come and go, living a normal life in that apartment, helped ease my lingering fears. But even now, years later, I sometimes find myself thinking about Mr. Thompson. When I'm walking home late at night, or when I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, I'm transported back to those unsettling months when I first moved to LA. I never did find out what really happened to Mr. Thompson, or if the things I experienced were real or just products of an overactive imagination. In the end, I had to accept that some mysteries remain unsolved. These days, I'm still in LA, still chasing my dreams. I've moved to a different apartment, a brighter, more open place in a busier neighborhood. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I find myself listening for footsteps in the hallway or watching for a faint light in the window across the way. And I wonder about Mr. Thompson and all the other mysteries that hide behind closed doors in this vast, strange city. I'd always dreamed of living in Portland, Oregon. The lush greenery, the vibrant culture, and the promise of a slower-paced life had been calling to me for years. So when I finally landed a job at a small tech startup in the city, I was over the moon. After weeks of searching, I found the perfect little house in the Selwood Moreland neighborhood. It was a charming craftsman bungalow with a spacious backyard that I immediately envisioned turning into a beautiful garden. The house needed some work, but I was up for the challenge. I spent my first few weekends in Portland painting, fixing squeaky floorboards, and planning my garden. The previous owners had left the yard a bit neglected, but I could see its potential. There was a large maple tree that provided dappled shade, perfect for shade-loving plants, and a sunny spot that would be ideal for vegetables. As I was clearing out some overgrown weeds, I met my next-door neighbor, Linda. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and a warm smile. She welcomed me to the neighborhood and mentioned that she was an avid gardener herself. I could see why she said that. Her yard was immaculate, with perfectly manicured flower beds and a vegetable garden that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Linda offered to give me some gardening tips, and I gratefully accepted. She showed me around her garden, pointing out various plants and sharing advice on what grew well in Portland's climate. I was impressed by her knowledge and enthusiasm. She even offered to lend me some tools to get started. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into creating my garden. I spent hours researching native plants, drawing up plans, and preparing the soil. Linda would often pop her head over the fence to check on my progress and offer suggestions. It felt good to have such a friendly and helpful neighbor. As spring progressed, my garden started to take shape. I had planted a mix of flowers, shrubs, and vegetables. There were colorful zinnias, fragrant lavender, and even a small patch of strawberries. I was particularly proud of my heirloom tomato plants, which were already starting to produce tiny green fruits. One morning, as I was watering my plants before heading to work, I noticed something odd. A small rosemary bush that I had planted near the fence seemed to be missing. At first, I thought I must be mistaken. Maybe I had planted it somewhere else and forgotten. But as I looked around, I couldn't find it anywhere. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe an animal had dug it up overnight. These things happen in gardens, right? But over the next few days, I started noticing other small changes. A clump of daylilies seemed smaller than I remembered. My prized lavender plant had fewer blooms than the day before. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Gardening was new to me, and I figured I was probably just misjudging the growth and changes of my plants. But then one morning, I went out to check on my vegetable patch and found an entire row of lettuce seedlings gone. This wasn't something I could explain away. I started paying closer attention to my garden, even taking photos each evening so I could compare day to day. And sure enough, plants were disappearing. Sometimes it was just a few flowers or herbs. Other times, entire plants would vanish overnight. Naturally, my thoughts turned to Linda. She was the only one I had told about my gardening plans in detail. Plus, she had easy access to my yard from her side of the fence. But every time I saw her, she was nothing but kind and enthusiastic about my progress. She'd compliment my choices and ask how things were growing. It seemed impossible that she could be behind the disappearances. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that as my garden seemed to be shrinking, hers appeared to be thriving more than ever. New plants would appear in her beds that looked suspiciously like ones I had recently lost. But I had no proof, and I felt silly even considering the idea that my sweet older neighbor was stealing my plants. Things came to a head when my prized tomato plants disappeared. I had babied those plants from seeds, carefully tending to them for weeks. They were just starting to produce ripe fruit, and I had been looking forward to my first homegrown tomato. But one morning, they were gone. Not just the fruits, but the entire plants, as if they had never been there at all. I was devastated and angry. I decided it was time to confront Linda, even if it made me feel like a crazy person. I walked next door and knocked, trying to calm my nerves. When Linda answered, I took a deep breath and explained what had been happening in my garden. I tried to keep my tone neutral, not wanting to outright accuse her, but hoping she might offer some explanation. Linda listened with a concerned expression, shaking her head sympathetically. She suggested that maybe we had a problem with local wildlife or even teenagers playing pranks. She offered to help me set up some motion-activated lights to deter any nighttime intruders. Her response seemed so genuine that I felt ashamed for suspecting her. As I turned to leave, feeling embarrassed and confused, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in a corner of Linda's porch, was a familiar-looking pot with 3 healthy tomato plants. Plants that looked exactly like my missing ones. I didn't say anything at that moment. I was too shocked and unsure of myself. I went home and spent the rest of the day obsessing over what I had seen. Was it possible that Linda had been stealing my plants all along? But why? Her garden was already beautiful and thriving. It didn't make any sense. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I heard noises outside, imagining Linda sneaking around in my garden. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and peered out my bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard. What I saw made my jaw drop. There, illuminated by the moonlight, was Linda. She was in my garden, carefully digging up one of my rose bushes. I watched in disbelief as she gently lifted the plant, roots and all, and carried it back to her yard. I was furious. All those weeks of work, all those plants I had carefully chosen and nurtured, gone because of my neighbor's bizarre plant-stealing habit. I wanted to rush outside and confront her then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the surreal nature of the situation, or maybe I was just too stunned to react. The next morning, I woke up determined to address the issue head-on. I marched over to Linda's house and knocked on her door. When she answered, I calmly but firmly told her that I had seen her in my garden the night before. I asked her why she had been stealing my plants. To my surprise, Linda didn't deny it. Instead, she burst into tears. Between sobs, she explained that gardening had been her and her late husband's shared passion. He had passed away the previous year, and she had been struggling to cope with the loss. Tending to their garden alone had become too painful, reminding her of everything she had lost. She said that when she saw me starting my garden, something in her snapped. She became obsessed with the idea of recreating the garden she and her husband had built together. In her grief-stricken mind, taking my plants seemed like the only way to bring back a piece of her old life. I stood there, not knowing how to react. On one hand, I was still angry about the theft of my plants and the violation of my trust. On the other hand, I could see the pain and loneliness in Linda's eyes. She was clearly a woman struggling with a profound loss. After a long, awkward silence, I suggested that we sit down and talk. Over the next few hours, Linda opened up about her husband, their shared love of gardening, and how lost she had felt since his death. She apologized profusely for her actions, offering to replace all the plants she had taken and to help me rebuild my garden. In the end, we came to an understanding. Linda agreed to return the plants she had taken that were still alive and to help me replant my garden. In return, I offered to garden with her, to share in the hobby that had meant so much to her and her husband. Over the next few weeks, Linda and I worked side by side in both our gardens. She taught me more about gardening than I could have learned from any book, sharing stories about each plant and the memories attached to them. We divided some of her perennials and planted them in my yard, and we started some new plants from seeds together. As we worked, I could see Linda starting to heal. She smiled more, laughed at my clumsy attempts at weeding, and seemed to find joy in gardening again. For my part, I gained not just a beautiful garden, but also a friend, and a deeper appreciation for the healing power of nature and community. My garden eventually flourished, more beautiful than I could have imagined, filled with plants that had stories and history. And while the start of my Portland gardening adventure wasn't what I expected, it led to a deeper connection with my community and a friendship I never saw coming. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.